Again, we'll continue with the Gospel of Mark today. Okay, so last time we looked at it was Mark chapter 7, and then a few verses, right, on Mark chapter 7. I think we talked about, was Jesus an ex-racist? Okay, last time. So today what we're going to do is we're going to continue with that. So, but we have like a long text today. We're going to look at Mark 7, verse 31. To chapter 8, verse 38. Right, so that's a long. This is there will be a long reading, but I'm gonna make sure that we will be done on time. Okay, so it doesn't mean that we're gonna have like a long sermon here. Okay, and we're not gonna treat it as a sermon. So if you have questions, feel free to what? Feel free to ask me. Okay, and then we'll figure something out here. So let's look at Mark 7, verse 31. And again, I would like to thank you for continually, supporting the group, okay? And then we have the Kyoto parents, right? Brother Gino and Sister Felma are in the Philippines. So Florence is the one taking care of the kids now. Okay. So, and we want to thank Sister Felma for doing this like for a long time, taking care of the kids every Sunday after Sunday. So let's look at Mark 7, verse 31. It's going to be a long reading. I'm going to try to read it as fast as I can. And then we'll go with the PowerPoint here. Then he returned, he referring to Jesus, from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Epata, something like that, right? That is, be open. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So, I'm going to skip some parts here, so that it will not be a long reading. So from in chapter 8, verses 1 to 9, this is about the feeding of the 4,000. I think there are like five loaves of bread with 3 fish. And then Jesus performed a miracle and fed 4,000 people. Okay? And then we looked at verse 11 of chapter 8. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. Verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, it is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand? And then after that, verses 22 to 26, Jesus cured a blind man. Okay? Are you guys following the sequence of events here? The sequence of events will be essential for understanding what will be the sermon about today. Okay? So then he cured a blind man, and then verse 27. So we're almost done reading the text. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they answered him, John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. and still others, one of the prophets. He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah," and he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Last set of verses, from 31 to 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life?" Last verse. "Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Okay. Now, so I entitled this sermon, "Sensation Without Understanding." Okay. The problem with spiritual blindness. I discovered, I think it was 3 weeks ago, that there's a way for me to actually lessen the amount of time that I will use for preparing sermons. Yes, because in the beginning I was like preparing for like 15 hours for one sermon, and it's hard when you're like working from Monday to Friday and then spend 15 hours preparing for sermons. I noticed that when I write my sermon down, right, whatever I wanted to say, it's taking me forever to do. Okay, I don't know why it's like that. But when I use PowerPoint, it only took me 6 hours last night. Okay, that's like, oh, there you go, right? That will actually make my life a little easier. But I did the same thing last week, and it also took me about 6-7 hours to do. So so I guess that's a good thing, right? They actually cut it in like half. Okay, so from now on, I'm gonna try to do PowerPoint all the time because it looks like that's probably easier for me because I just put bullet points in instead of just writing everything out. Okay. Now, so let's look at this: sensation without understanding, the problem of a spiritual blindness. One of the things I wanted to talk about today, right? I want to talk about the gospel, the nature of the gospels, because if you fail to understand this point, you're not going to understand how I'm actually trying to interpret the text here. That's why I wanted to do this. Okay. Now, also, what I wanted to do, since we started with the book of Mark, with the Gospel of Mark, I wanted to at least, in some sense, give you some kind of an basic introduction to the book of Mark. So that when you finish talking about the Gospel of Mark, I'm hoping that you probably have at least some deep understanding of what the book what that particular gospel is about. So probably it's more like some kind of an intro to the Gospel of Mark that you will get that you will take in a university, for example. Okay. So let's look at this question here. Are the Gospels historical accounts, accurate history? Okay, and I think that's an important question to ask. Okay, now the gospel authors did not intend to present accurate historical accounts of Jesus' life, so make sure you understand that. Okay, the gospel authors were not when they were writing the gospels, they were not trying to give us accurate history. Okay, how do we know that it's not accurate history? One, there are actually alleged discrepancy. But not necessarily irreconcilable, but there's still what? Discrepancies in the Gospels. If you actually read the Gospels, you probably noticed that. Account of how Judas died in one Gospel is different from the account of how Judas died in another Gospel. So there's some kind of a conflict. I'm not saying that they are irreconcilable, but I think they are reconcilable in some sense. Okay? Are you guys following me here? I think they're reconcilable, but there's still what? Discrepancies. So, for example, when you actually look at the sequences of events in the different Gospels, they're also what? Different. The ordering of the sequence of events are different. So that tells you that the Gospel authors were not trying to what? They were not trying to give you accurate history. That was not their task. Again, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you look at the sequences of events, you will notice the sequences of events have been what? Switched. So that tells you it's not what? It's not accurate. They're not trying to give you accurate history.
Yeah.
You have to understand the temporal gap between the life of Jesus and when the gospel authors wrote the gospel. They were writing this probably 20 years after the resurrection. So we cannot expect what? Accuracy here. Do you guys follow me? Am I making sense here? You know, you don't expect accuracy like me writing something that happened to me 20 years ago. Does that make sense? Oh, I can ask people, hey, you know, what did I do during that time? You know, you remember? Okay, there you go. So I can give an account, but I will not pretend that it will be what? An accurate account.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, so you have to understand that this is based on when they were writing, based on oral tradition. Okay, and you know how oral tradition works. You know, it's like that.
Whatever they remember.
Yeah, whatever they remember. It's based on what? Word of mouth,
Like
right?
telephone. Yeah.
It's like telephone. What do you call that?
Yeah,
The game?
telephone.
Yeah, where you know, if I tell you something and by the time it reaches
Yeah.
System Minerva, you know, it's probably a little different already. Something like that, right? And you also have to understand that it's probably based on some, you know, loosely collected accounts. Okay, so whoever is the author of the gospel, they're just putting it together. Okay, and again, this is based on things that were committed to what? Memory. They're just trying to remember what happened here. Okay. A better way of actually looking at the gospel is this. This is at least how I read the gospels. I treat the gospel as a non-fiction novel. You guys following me here? You guys know there are people who are like that. They will actually write a non-fiction, it's a novel, right, about Martin Luther King Jr. So the goal is not to give you an accurate history. So the whole time, the writer is also what? Trying to creatively tell you the story. Do you guys following me here? Right? Creatively what? Telling you the story. Okay? Because there's a specific purpose in mind. They want to evangelize. They want to tell the world about Jesus. Mark, the author, as the one arranging the stories about Jesus. Okay, so here's what I wanted to point out here. When you look at Mark, what he was doing is that he was arranging them in a specific what? Order. Because he wanted to tell what? He wanted to tell a narrative about Jesus. Okay, there are available accounts of what Jesus did, but they're not necessarily in order, so he was just what? He was putting them in order in a creative way. I hope you guys are following me here. Okay, does that make sense? So when people tell me, oh, the gospel is not even an accurate account of the historical Jesus, and my response is, I know, that was not what they were trying to do. Do you guys follow me? That was not, they were not trying to do that. They were trying to arrange it in such an order. I hope I'm clear here. Okay? Now, so let's look at this. I said here, no chapters, no verses. Do you guys know that when the Bible was written, there were no chapters and verses? Do you guys know that, right? Some of you are probably surprised by that. Okay? The early manuscripts of the Bible were not divided into chapters and what? Verses. Why am I saying that? Why is this even an important thing for us to know? Divisions or subdivisions into chapters and verses as the text had been as the text had been distributed, right? So people begin to what? Put chapters and verses, depending on which one they think are what? Related stories. And then I put here such divisions or divisions as paratext or materials outside. So what do I mean by paratext? Okay. The way the Bible has been divided into chapters and verses affect the way we interpret it. The way it has been what? Divided into chapters and verses will affect the way we what?
Interpret it.
We interpret it. Okay? I hope you guys are following here. But keep in mind, those divisions were actually what? Not in the original text. Somebody just did that in the past. Okay? Along the way, they were like just dividing it into chapters and verses. Now, so that's why when you actually look at our studies here, I don't usually do by chapter, but sometimes, you know, it's a little off. chapter 7, 31 to what? Chapter 8, 38. Because those divisions were arbitrarily what? Done in the past. Okay? Now, so what then is our relevant hermeneutical task here? What is our task of interpretation? One is this: understanding authorial intent behind his distinctive arrangement of the stories with specific structure. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to figure out what was Mark's intention for arranging the stories in the way he arranged it. He arranged them. Why did he arrange them that way? Do you guys follow the question here? So when you read it, you're trying to figure out why did he arrange it? Why did he arrange the stories in that particular order? What is it that he was trying to what? Trying to convey by arranging it in that way. And whatever I will present to you today, you have to understand that that should also influence the way you will interpret what? The text. Okay. So, from blindness to maturity. Blindness here has to do with the failure to spiritually sense what should have been obviously presented right in front of one's spiritual sensibilities. You know, there are times when something is already in front of you, but you still don't what? You still don't see it. It happens a lot, right, to us. Okay, sometimes I'm looking for something, and it's right there in front of me, but for some reason I'm just not seeing it. Right? Spiritual blindness is something like that. You know, something is actually being revealed to you, but somehow you're just completely what? Oblivious to what is being actually revealed. Okay? And then a second point here, maturational development of the spiritual sort involves the process that frees us from such blindness. The point I want to make is that I think what Mark is trying to do in the passage that we read is that he thinks that we start from what? Spiritual blindness, but as we mature, are you guys following here? We begin to see what? What God is actually trying to what? Reveal. It's been there all along, but somehow we just don't see it. But as we mature, right? As you improve your what? Your way of thinking, then you begin to see what has been, you know, what's in front of you all this time. Okay? I hope I'm clear here. So I'm going to skip this quote from Kant because it's going to make the sermon more complicated. Okay? So there you go. So what do I mean by Mark's distinctive arrangement of the stories? So I want you to see this, and hopefully this interpretation will actually work. Okay? In order for us to understand what this passage is really about. Okay? So I don't know if it's probably too small, huh? Can you guys see it though? You guys can see it? Okay. If you notice the story, it started with the manifestations of divine power. Remember, God healed someone who was what?
Grace. Ask me. Oh, the blind.
Oh yeah.
And maybe,
There you go.
like,
Oh, to move it? There we can move it. So.
there you go.
There you go. Okay. So let's look at this, right? So it says manifestations of divine power, part 1. What was the first miracle here in this passage? Jesus healed someone who was what? Deaf.
Yeah.
So I'm referring to this as auditory perception of what? Divine power. Somehow, you know, because he was able to healed, right? He was deaf, and then now he heard Jesus, right? So somehow he saw the manifestation of what? Divine power. Remember the title of the sermon? Sensation without what? Understanding. So they were able to sense something. Is that clear? What's the next? What was the next miracle here? Gustatory perception of divine power. Jesus divided those loaves of bread. Are you guys following me here? And then, so that has something to do with what? Sense of taste. You guys following me here? Sense of taste. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sense of hearing, sense of taste. But somehow, the whole time, right, what you will notice here is that people completely, they're actually not getting what was happening here. You guys following me here? So remember, when Jesus left after he actually fed 4,000 people, he went to a place, and then the Pharisees approached him and asked him, give us a sign. right? If I was Jesus, I probably what? Hit them on the head, right? And say, what sign are you looking for? Right? I already healed someone who was deaf, right? I already fed 4,000 people with 5 loaves of bread. Does that make sense? Do you guys see what I'm trying to point out here? You know, do you see how Mark is actually arranging this in some order? So there was a manifestation of divine power, and then somehow people are just completely what? Oblivious. Right? Now, some of you might wonder, but the Pharisees were not there. They didn't see Jesus distributing feeding 4,000 people. So let's look at the next part. So the next part is about the disciples, right? Worrying among themselves, asking, "Oh, we forgot to bring bread. We forgot to bring bread." Right? And then Jesus talked to them and he says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees." And then they were talking to each other and said, "Oh, Jesus is probably asking us, how come we didn't bring bread?" And then somehow Jesus was like, What? After feeding 4,000 people with 5 loaves of bread, you guys are actually wondering about bread right now? Right? Do you guys follow? Does that make sense? Jesus did something in front of their eyes, but somehow they still did not what? They still did not see it. They still didn't see it, right? They were like wondering, oh, he's talking about bread. Right? He's talking about the yeast of the Pharisees, right? He's talking about bread. I'm assuming the disciples really, they're probably stupid, right? It's weird, right? How Jesus fed 4,000 with 5 loaves of bread, and the whole time they're like, as if they didn't even understand at all, right? What it is that Jesus was trying to do. Okay. And that's why Jesus actually talked to them. You guys have eyes? It looks like you guys have eyes, but you guys cannot what?
See.
Cannot see. You have ears, but somehow you cannot what?
Hear.
You cannot hear. Okay. Isn't that the problem? Okay. I hope I'm making sense here. I know it might be a little complicated, but look at what he said here, right? So he says, he said something like this. "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 4,000? You guys don't remember that? I just did that, But now you're like worrying about bread. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, and then after that, Jesus performed another miracle. Okay. So what did he do? He healed a blind man. Do you guys see the sequences of events here? Healing the deaf, right? Feeding the 4,000, right? And healing what? The blind man. So now it has something to do with what? Our sense of seeing. Okay. But here, what is different here is that it appears that they begin to what? They begin to understand now. Okay? They're beginning to understand. So Jesus began to ask the disciples, so who do you guys think I am? Some people thought, and then somebody said, oh, some people thought you're a prophet, right? Or some people thought you're Isaiah. Some people thought you are the new John the Baptist. And then he looked at Peter and says, so what do you think I am? Who do you think I am? And then Peter said, you are the Messiah. Do you guys see the progression here? Right? There will be manifestations of divine power, right? And then somehow, it's still oblivious to people. Another manifestation of what? Divine power. And then, but this time there's what? An improvement. Peter recognized who Jesus was. Right? You guys follow the progression of the story here. So what happened after Peter said that? Jesus gave them further revelations. So Jesus foretold his imminent faith. He told them, oh, I will be suffering. I will be put to death, but I will be resurrecting from the dead again. I will be resurrecting from the dead, blah, blah, blah. And then, do you guys notice what Peter did here? It appeared that he actually still did not what? Fully understand what's going on. So despite the fact that he recognized Jesus as the Messiah, but when Jesus began to tell him that what? I will be suffering, I will die, and I will be what? I will resurrect from the dead. Remember, Peter approached Jesus and rebuked him and says, I think he probably said, what the heck are you talking about? what do you mean you'll be dying or something like that? Why do you, why do you, what do you mean you are actually suffering? And then remember, Jesus looked at Peter and he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." At that point, you recognize that Peter didn't really have what? A full understanding of what Jesus was actually trying to accomplish. Despite the fact that he recognized Jesus as the Messiah, right? But somehow he didn't really understand what that means.
Yeah.
Do you guys see the development here? Okay. I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what then is the full understanding here? Full understanding as full realization of the demand of discipleship. Now, what do I mean by this? What is full understanding means in this particular context? Full understanding here means understanding that the cost of discipleship is actually what? Radical and total commitment. And it turns out that that is actually what Jesus, or at least what Mark thought, what Jesus was trying to what? Trying to make them understand. The very moment you realize that the cost of discipleship means what? Radical and total commitment. At that point, you can actually say that you have what? A full understanding of what it is that actually Jesus was trying to convey. I hope you guys see the sequence here. Okay, do you guys see? If you try to ask me, what then is the most mature stance of a Christian? The most mature stance of a Christian is when a Christian understands that the cost of discipleship means what? Radical and total commitment. That's it, right? When you look at Jesus, he was talking about self-denial, right? For Jesus' sake. Suffering for Jesus' sake. But not just that, but willingness to lose one's life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel. And then Jesus also talked about shamelessly living for Jesus. Do you guys see the end point of all this discussion here? It started from obliviousness or blindness, and then when can you really say that you can fully see? You can only say that you can fully see only when you realize that that's what it means to actually follow Jesus, is to be radically and totally committed to Jesus. That's it. You have to understand, during that time, Jesus needed that, because Jesus knew that if you follow him, there will be what? Consequences. Okay. If you follow him, there will be what? Consequences. So he wanted to be assured that if you really want to follow me, things that you need to do: denial of the self, willingness to suffer, willingness to what? To lose one's life, right? And shamelessly living for me. That's it. If you can do all that, right? That is spiritual maturity. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, so let's look at this. We're almost done, see? I told you. It's a long passage, but we were able to do this in, 30, 40 minutes. Reflections on Mark's distinctive arrangement of the stories. What Mark tried to what? Convey. What is it that he was trying to convey? Okay, so I'm pretty much just concluding here. So this is going to be the main part of the sermon here. Blindness and maturity. Okay. So let's look at this. 4 points under this heading, or subheading. Being witnesses of the manifestations of divine power does not guarantee spiritual understanding. Let me read that again. Being witnesses of the manifestations of divine power does not guarantee spiritual understanding. Does that make sense? The fact that you witnessed the manifestation of divine power, it doesn't mean that you actually have spiritual understanding.
Who would think?
Do you guys follow? Does that make sense? Let me illustrate it in two different ways. A parent who has done everything he or she could possibly do for his or her immature child, okay? You can do something for your immature child if you have an immature child, or like someone who's very, very young. You can show them love, right? You can show them affection. You can show them attention. But the whole time, even if you're actually showing all that, Many of our children do not even recognize that. Remember when I was with Jean about a week ago, a few days ago, I think when we went out to eat, when Jean told me that, when they used to live in Victorville, and his parents work in LA, and he said, I didn't realize that they drive that far, right? When we were like little kids. I just realized that now that I'm already what?
Driving.
Oh, no, that they were actually that they were actually doing all of those sacrifices for them, right? Because you think they just go to work, right, and then they just come home. That's it, right? That's probably what he was thinking as a child. So again, if you notice, you're showing this to your kids, right? But somehow they just don't what? They don't understand it. Is that something that happens to us too?
Yeah.
So even if you are already witnesses, right, of the manifestations of divine power, for some reason we're still not getting it. Being witnesses of the manifestations of divine power does not mean that what? You have spiritual understanding. Remember what happened to the ancient Israelites? God was actually delivering them all the time, right? Rescuing them all the time. But somehow, the whole time, they have no clue. Still, they didn't have what? Spiritual understanding. You guys follow me here? Sometimes with Tress, when I talk to Tress, I tell him that. I tell him, we sacrifice all this, right? Because, we want you to have a house, we want you to have food to eat, we want to have money to pay your child care. Do you guys following me here? Because I want him to understand, because sometimes he probably just doesn't understand it.
No.
So even if you show it, still not going to be what? It's not going to register in their head for whatever reason. Do you guys follow me here? Right? But that's a sign of immaturity when you don't understand what's going on here, right? Second point, spiritual maturity is a precondition for spiritual understanding. It means that no understanding without maturity. You will never understand what God is revealing to you if you are not spiritually mature. That's it. Spiritual maturity is what? A precondition so that you can understand it.
Yes.
Okay? Just simply sensing it, that's why sensation without understanding. Just by just merely what? Sensing it, it doesn't do any good. If you are actually what? Immature. Because God can be showing you all sorts of things. Right? He can actually divide the Pacific Ocean for you so that you can cross. But if you are immature, you're still not going to get it. I hope that makes sense. Right? It's like, here's an illustration here, right? Someone who's scientifically an uninitiated student who's reading a technical book on physics. Do you guys remember that? You're like reading your physics textbook, and the whole time you're like reading it, even when you were in high school.
It's words.
And it's just words. Are you sensing something? Yes. Can you read them? Yes. But the problem is, do you understand them? No. Does that make sense? Yeah, exactly. When you read philosophy, the same thing. I can be reading like one whole page for 3 days and still wondering, what the heck is that about? Right? I have no clue what the heck is that about. Because I'm reading it, right? I even try to outline it. But somehow, because I was what? Not mature enough to understand it, I just don't get it. That's why maturity is what? Essential. Maturity is what?
Essential.
Essential. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Okay? Maturational development is a process that takes time and energy.
Yes.
It takes time and energy. In order for you to mature, it takes time. It takes a long time. I remember when I was writing my dissertation on Kant. If you know something about Immanuel Kant is probably one of the worst writers in philosophy. Okay, because he's not a very good writer, but he's very insightful, but not a very good writer. So when I was writing my dissertation on him, my dissertation advisor discouraged me and she said, don't do a dissertation on Kant. You're gonna end up, in pursuing your PhD forever, because it's just almost impossible for you to understand it, well. But I was hard-headed, right? I said, no, I can do it, right? And then I like read it without any comprehension for years. I was reading for a long time. But for some reason, I'm fascinated by what he's saying, but I just don't understand what it is. Okay? Do you guys follow me here? Right? Because I was not mature enough. But what happened to me after being in grad school for so long? I acquired what? Maturity. Right? At some point, after 10 years of reading Kant, right? Every time I go read the page, I'm actually understanding it. I was like, wow, it took this long, okay? Why? Because it takes what? Time and energy. The same thing with maturing as a Christian. It takes time and what? Energy. Okay? Last point under this subheading. Relevant experiences allow us to develop a perspective that makes it possible for us to understand what is divinely manifested. The more exposures, the more experiences you have, the richness of your experience, right, will give you the perspective to understand whatever it is that God is what? Manifesting. Sometimes when we suffer, we don't really think that they are actually, our sufferings are essential to our growth. Why is it the case that our sufferings are essential to our growth? Because it gives us a different perspective.
Yes.
Right? We become more mature after we what? We suffer. Do you guys following here? Taking care of my daughter for that long, prior to her death, right, for 13 years. It changed me as a person, right? It gave me a very different what? Perspective. I began to read Christianity in a completely different way. My faith, right, has been what? It was different. Why? Because going through that process of taking care of a sick child for 13 years, she lived for 13 years, my daughter, right? Taking care of her the whole time, right? Somehow changed my what? Changed my perspective. There are things that I claim to believe about God 20 years ago that now I cannot even say that. Because of my experience with my daughter, I begin to understand who God really is, right? Do you guys following me here? I'm not rejecting God.
Yeah.
But I just have a very different way of seeing God after that experience. Because, again, exposures, experiences, that helps us what?
Mature.
Understand. They help us mature. You guys does that make sense? Now, so let's look at spiritual blindness here. I only have 2 more slides after this and then we're done. Spiritual blindness. Based on what Jesus said here in Mark 8, 14 to 21. Blindness, spiritual blindness is actually caused by many things. 1, blindness due to what? Intellectual immaturity. Do you guys following me? Intellectual what? Immaturity. If you're intellectually immature, right, you're not going to see anything that's being revealed to you by God. Because some of them are very what? Complex. Do you guys following me? Remember even when Jesus was actually preaching, a lot of people will actually leave, and then they will say, oh, I don't even understand what he's talking about. And then Jesus will actually look at his disciples and ask the disciples, do you guys understood what I said? And they're like, oh, again, do you guys follow me? Because it requires some kind of what? Some level of intellectual maturity in order for you to understand what it is that God is, or what Jesus was actually revealing. Now, so that's why he said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Remember the disciples were wondering, what the heck is that? Is he talking about bread? Okay, but yeast here has something to do with the corrupt, something corruptive that can be spread out. Okay, because the yeast, I'm assuming, it is what?
It spreads out.
It spreads out. Okay, so that's why. What is this? The legalism, right, of the Pharisees. Are you guys following me? This is somehow, there's something contagious about it. Okay, that's why you have to watch out for it. So blindness due to intellectual immaturity, it has something to do with ignorance, stupidity, and irrationality. If you are ignorant of things, then you're not going to understand it. You can be ignorant without being stupid. Do you guys following me here, right? I'm ignorant about most things in physics. Do you guys follow? I'm not necessarily stupid. I'm just ignorant of most of those things. So it doesn't matter what you tell me, even if you bring Einstein here and Einstein explains it to me. And because of my ignorance, I'm still not going to get whatever it is that he's talking about. Do you guys follow? That's why intellectual maturity is somehow what? Essential. Stupidity will hinder you from what? From understanding it too. Right? Irrationality. Okay? I hope you guys are following me here. Second point. Blindness due to hardened hearts. You don't see what God is actually revealing to you. I'm not saying you, right? To us, right? If we are what? Prideful. Does that make sense? So because we have a hardened heart. Okay, here, this one. Okay? Close-mindedness. Does that make sense? Right? Hardened hearts, right? Close-mindedness. You're not going to see it if you're actually going to be what? Close-minded. What else? Dogmatism. What is dogmatism? Have you guys met people who thinks that what they believe is right and everybody else is wrong? Right? We met a lot of people who are like that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Yes, I know somebody.
Somebody. I don't want to guess. I'm just kidding.
You know.
I'm just kidding. Now, but you guys see what I'm trying to point out here? Is that clear? Right? If you're dogmatic, just like the Pharisees, you're not going to actually what? You're not going to see what God is trying to what? Reveal to you. Blindness due to inoperative sensibilities. Of course, when your eyes are not working well, right, then you're not going to see things. If your ears are not working well, then you're not going to hear things. Right? But I think it has more to do with this incapacity to discern. Is that clear? Things are already happening and you're still not what? Getting it. Right? You guys, I always say that Florence has this gift of discernment. Okay. I don't seem to have that. I can't discern people. Right? Florence can. Right? And she's usually right. Okay. So I'm talking about, if you're incapable of discerning things, then you're not going to see what God is actually what? Revealing. Lack of wisdom. Now, you guys following here, right? Lack of what? Lack of wisdom. Inexperience or lack of exposures. Right? Lack of experience, lack of exposures will actually make it impossible for you to understand whatever it is that God is revealing to you. Right? Lack of full understanding of the cost of discipleship in this case, right? Last point here, and then we have one last slide. Blindness due to forgetfulness. Sometimes you just don't understand because you just what? Forget. I'm very forgetful. You can ask Florence all the time, right? I forget a lot of things. Okay. But being forgetful, right, will actually prevent you from seeing what God is also trying to reveal. Right? Failure to remember. Failure to draw obvious connections. Okay? Inattentiveness and absent-mindedness. Are you guys following me here? Is this making sense to you guys, what I'm actually explaining here? This is spiritual blindness. Last point. So, we're able to do this in 40 minutes. Okay? Last point. The goal of spiritual maturity. And this is based on Mark 8:34-38. How do I know that I've been freed from spiritual blindness? How do I know that? One, when I fully understand that it is not about me at all, but about Jesus, His gospel, and His vision. The moment you understand that it's not about you, but it's about Jesus, it's about the gospel, it's about the vision of Jesus, at some point you should realize that probably you're freed from what? Spiritual blindness. Because you begin to see it's not about me. It's not about you, right? It's about Jesus. I hope that makes sense. That is what we call self-denial, right? Now, we're not just talking about self-denial here just for the sake of self-denying. That's probably what Buddhists wants to do, right? They talk about self-denial too. But here, in the context of Jesus, self-denial for the sake of what? Of Jesus. For the sake of the gospel. Is that clear? I hope I'm making sense here. Okay. So how do I know that I've been freed from spiritual blindness? When I fully understand that I need to be willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus, the gospel, and His vision. Once you realize that you're ready to suffer for Christ, then you know that you must be freed from what? Spiritual blindness. Do you guys follow me here?
But I think you have to be open to know that your suffering is, how can I explain it? Like when you were taking care of your daughter, you had at some point, maybe not at first, I don't know, but at some point, now that you see things differently, you have to know that there was something to be learned or something you were supposed to get, or I don't know how to explain it, but in order for you to get to peace with it, and it's okay.
And like I said,
So you got to recognize you're not just suffering because, oh, poor me, or I did something wrong, or it's about that.
Yes.
And so,
that's a good
but you got to be open to that.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
and that's why I said that's when you can
okay.
tell that you're actually freed from what? The spiritual blindness, when you're open to that.
it's like my niece just she's due February 13th, baby.
Mhm.
But they had to do emergency C on Wednesday. So the baby's only 2 pounds. It may be blind, the lungs aren't working, blood pressure's up, blah, 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 blah. And so my brother, he was kind of on the fence a little bit when my mom died because she was so healthy and how she just died, so he's kind of like mad at Jesus, and so he's not believing anymore because he's mad, whatever he's doing. And so now this just put him way the heck over the other end. So I said, well, I'll keep praying for Stephanie. It'll be how it's supposed to be. You know what? Just save it, and please don't tell Stephanie that. Like, you know what I mean? So people, they get like this, and then it's like, and so then at what point are you think it's just a free life and everything is going to be good?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Like,
So maturity, you understand it.
Yeah.
You become mature when you understand that you're willing to suffer, right? For the sake of Christ.
So it's really hard. They're making things so much harder because they're like this.
Yes.
Where do you go? You got to go to somebody, no?
No, that's good. Do you guys follow what we're discussing?
It's crazy, yeah.
So how do I know that I've been freed from spiritual blindness?
Yeah.
Third point. When I fully understand that I need to be willing to die for the sake of Jesus, the gospel, and what? His vision. And then the fourth point here is when I fully understand that I need to shamelessly live for Jesus, the gospel, and his what? His vision. Now, I hope you guys are following what I'm explaining here. Right? Last point. What is the goal of spiritual maturity? 1, living a life that is radically and totally committed to Jesus, the gospel, and his what? His vision. And then secondly, living such a life should give us the necessary perspective to fully understand what God wants us to do or who God wants us to be. Right? Once you understand that Christian commitment requires self-denial, self-sacrifice, right, willingness to die for the sake of Jesus, once you realize all that, that should give you a perspective. Right? And that is the right, from that vantage point, you realize what God is actually trying to reveal. When you have that kind of attitude. But without that kind of attitude, you're not going to be what?
You're not gonna get it.
You're not going to get
You
it.
don't understand.
Every time God is trying to reveal something to you, you have all sorts of what? Excuses. Right? Instead of admitting that God wants me to deny myself, you're going to try to what? Oh, God cannot be asking all that, right? God wants me to live what? A normal life. God cannot be asking me to do that. I have kids to what? To take care of. I hope you guys are following me here, right? We make those kind of what? Not just you, me too. We make those kind of excuses. That's why, God is probably revealing something to us. We're just not what? We're just not getting it because we make all these excuses. But once you realize that you have to give up yourself, you have to give up your life for the sake of Jesus, God can freely what? Reveal something to you, and you will understand it the way God wants it to be understood. I hope I'm making sense here. I hope you guys learned something from this passage, right? Okay, so